Clara Bellamy pressed her dead husband's ring into the soil above his grave and made herself one promise: she would never be foolish enough to believe a man could love her again. She was 30 years old, wide-hipped, heavy-shouldered, and living alone on a farm the whole town pitied. She had made peace with invisible. Then she baked a pie for her new neighbor, a quiet cowboy nobody knew knocked on his door, and watched the color drain from his face the moment he read her handwriting on the little note she'd tucked beneath the cloth. He'd seen that handwriting before, every single week. For 2 years. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning Clara decided to bake for a stranger, she had already told herself it meant nothing. That was the lie she needed. She needed it the way a person needs a lantern in a dark room, not because the lantern changes anything about the dark, but because standing in it without one feels too much like giving up. The pie was apple cinnamon. She made it the same way she made everything, carefully, quietly, without expecting anyone to notice. She rolled the crust twice because the first time felt lazy. She peeled 6 apples instead of 5 because 5 never seemed like enough. She added a pinch of nutmeg she couldn't really afford and told herself it was only good manners. A new neighbor deserved a proper welcome, that was all this was. She wrapped the pie in a square of flour-dusted cloth, tied it with a piece of twine she'd saved from a supply delivery 3 weeks ago, and tucked a small handwritten note beneath the knot. The note said only, "From your neighbor to the south. Hope you're settling in fine, Clara Bellamy." She didn't think anything of it. She had been writing notes her whole life. She walked the 1.5 miles to the abandoned ranch near Black Pine Ridge in her good brown boots, the ones she only wore when she wanted to feel like a woman who deserved to be seen. The October air was cold enough to sting, and the fields on either side of the road had gone the color of rust and old straw. She carried the pie with both hands, keeping it level, watching the ground for ruts. She was not nervous. She was not hopeful. She was a 30-year-old widow delivering a neighborly pie, and she had long since stopped confusing kindness with wanting something in return. When she reached the porch of the old Harmon place, the cabin that had sat empty for 3 years after old Silas Harmon's heart gave out, she saw smoke rising from the chimney. Someone had already repaired the front step. There was a new latch on the door. A saddle hung over the porch rail, freshly oiled. Somebody was making this place a home. She knocked. The door opened, and the moment it did, Clara understood, without being able to explain it, that something in the world had shifted. The man standing in the doorway was tall, broad across the chest, with the kind of shoulders that came from years of actual labor, not performance. His skin was weathered dark from sun and wind. His hair was brown, going gray at the temples, and his jaw carried 2 days of growth that hadn't quite decided whether it was becoming a beard. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and canvas trousers with a patch on one knee. His eyes were the thing that stopped her, dark gray. Tired, but careful the way eyes get when a person has spent a long time watching for danger and has finally reluctantly allowed themselves to stand still for a moment. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'm Clara Bellamy," she said. "I live down the South Road. I wanted to bring you something, seeing as you're new." She held out the pie. He didn't take it immediately. His gaze dropped to the note tucked beneath the twine, and something happened to his face. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that moved through him like a shudder that never fully broke the surface. "Everett Callahan," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the kind of voice that chose its words the way a man chooses his footing on unfamiliar ground. He took the pie. "Thank you, ma'am. It's apple cinnamon." "I hope you're not particular about cinnamon." "I'm not particular about anything," he said. There was a pause. She expected him to step back inside, maybe offer a polite nod, and that would be the end of it. She'd walk home, feel good about having done something decent, and go back to being the woman who lived quietly and kept to herself. Instead, he said, "Would you like some coffee?" She almost said no. The word was right there, familiar and safe. "No thank you, I ought to be getting back." She'd said it 100 times to 100 invitations she didn't believe she deserved. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. The inside of the cabin was sparse and clean. A bedroll in the corner, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove that was working hard against the October cold, a saddlebag hanging from a nail near the door, its flap buckled carefully, a single shelf with a tin coffee pot, a canteen, and a small bundle of papers tied with a piece of red string. She noticed the papers. She didn't know why. She sat down at the table while he poured coffee into two tin cups. She wrapped her hands around the cup when he set it in front of her and felt the warmth move up through her palms. "You come from far?" "Kansas," he said. "Before that, Wyoming." He stopped. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not. I just like knowing where people have been. It tells you something about where they're headed." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "And what does Kansas and Wyoming tell you?" "That you've been moving a long time," she said, "and that you stopped here." Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. "I did," he said quietly. They drank their coffee. Outside, a wind came up and pushed against the cabin walls. The stove ticked. Clara found herself thinking that the silence between them didn't feel the way silence usually did with strangers. It didn't feel like a gap that needed filling. It felt like a shared thing, like two people who'd both gotten comfortable with quiet and recognized it in each other. "You been in Willow Creek long?" he asked. 7 years. "My husband and I came out from Ohio. He passed 3 years ago." "Ranch accident. I'm sorry." "Thank you." She said it the way she always said it, directly, without making him feel the need to say more. People always felt the need to say more, and it never helped. "It's been a while. I manage fine. You live alone?" "I do." He nodded slowly, as if that answered something he hadn't asked out loud. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the porch. She'd already stepped down onto the path when she remembered she'd forgotten her twine. "I left the cloth too, if you don't mind returning it when you—" Clara, she turned. He was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the note in his other hand. He'd untucked it from the twine while she wasn't looking. He was holding it very carefully, too carefully, the way a man holds something fragile that he is afraid of understanding. "Did you say your name was Clara Bellamy?" "That's right." "You always write your notes by hand like this?" She blinked. "I don't know another way to write a note." He looked down at the paper again. When he looked back up, his expression was something she had never seen on a stranger's face before. It was recognition, and beneath the recognition, something that looked almost like grief, or wonder, or both at once. "I hope the pie suits you," she said carefully. "I'm sure it will." His voice was rough at the edges. "Thank you, ma'am." She walked home. She told herself the whole way that she was imagining things. That it was only a look. That a man who had been traveling for years probably just had that quality, that half-searching, half-haunted expression that came from spending too many nights in places that weren't yours. She told herself she was not going to think about him again. That was the second lie she needed that day. There was something Clara had never told the town of Willow Creek about herself. Not because she was ashamed of it exactly, but because some things feel too private and too precious to be handed over to people who had already decided who you were. 2 years before Everett Callahan arrived, Clara had started writing letters. It had begun by accident, the way most honest things begin. She'd been at the post office in late autumn, picking up a small package from her sister in Ohio, when she overheard the postmaster complaining about a letter that had been returned, no forwarding address. No last known location, no way to find the man it was meant for. The letter was from a woman who had since passed. The postmaster was going to burn it with the week's uncollectibles. Clara asked to see it first. She didn't know why. It was an impulse she couldn't justify. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a woman's careful hand, addressed to a man named only as W. It was a love letter, not passionate, not dramatic, but honest, in the way that letter writing from lonely people often is. The woman wrote about the way snow fell on a particular mountain she could see from her window. She wrote about a horse she'd had as a girl. She wrote that she hoped, wherever W. was he still allowed himself to feel sunlight on his face. Clara stood in the post office and read it twice. Then she looked at the return address on the envelope. The postmaster had already told her the man had no forwarding address. But the address he'd last been known at was a trail camp outside Reno, Nevada, where letters were forwarded to a general delivery service that sent mail forward along established cattle routes. Clara was a practical woman. She also believed, quietly and stubbornly, that some letters were too important to burn. She paid the small forwarding fee. It came to 11 cents and had the letter sent on. 3 weeks later, she received a reply, not to the dead woman whose letter she'd saved. To her. Dear Miss Bellamy, I don't know how to explain why I'm writing to you instead of returning the letter. I suppose it's because the woman who sent that letter died 6 months ago, and I'd already written back to her twice and never heard anything. I didn't know until I got your note. I suppose I'm writing because I don't know what else to do with the news, and you're the only person I've told. W. Clara had sat with that letter for a long time. Then she wrote back, Dear W. I think sometimes news like that needs a witness more than it needs a response. I'm sorry about your friend, I didn't know her, but her handwriting was beautiful. Clara Bellamy. That was how it started. Two strangers who had no reason to know each other, connected by a dead woman's letter and 11 cents in postage, writing back and forth across the impossible distances of the American West. W. never told her his full name. She never asked. He was a cowboy, that much was clear from his letters. He moved constantly. He wrote from Nevada, from Texas, from Colorado, from Wyoming. His letters came in clusters, 3 or 4 at once after weeks of silence, then nothing for a month. His handwriting was large and slightly uneven, like a man who'd learned to write as an adult and never quite lost the effort of it. He wrote about the land, about the way certain valleys caught the light in October, about the sound a river makes when it runs over limestone, about a gray mare he'd once had named Rosie, who could sense a storm 4 hours before it hit. He wrote about loneliness the way people only write about it when they've stopped being embarrassed by it. Clara wrote back about her garden, about the way her husband used to make coffee too strong and never apologized for it, about the particular silence of a farm in winter when everything living has either died or buried itself deep, about the loneliness she felt not for her husband specifically, but for the idea of being known, of having someone who noticed when she was tired, or scared, or needed help before she'd found the words to say so. She wrote about being a large woman in a small town. She didn't make it a confession or an apology. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, plainly, without decoration. People here see my size before they see anything else about me. I've gotten used to it, but I'll tell you what I miss most. I miss the idea of being looked at by someone who sees the rest of me first. I reckon that's wanting too much. But you ask me what I actually missed, and that's it. Clara W. response came 3 weeks later. It isn't wanting too much. Anyone who told you that was measuring you against the wrong things. You deserve to be looked at like someone worth looking at. You are worth looking at. I'm sorry nobody's said that plainly enough. W. Clara had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft along the folds. She kept it with the others in a small wooden box beneath her bed. 47 letters, 2 years of correspondence, from a man whose face she'd never seen and whose full name she still didn't know. She had never told a single person in Willow Creek about the letters. Not her neighbor, Mrs. Hatch, not the postmaster who passed them along. Not her sister, who worried about her enough already. The letters were hers, the only thing in her life that belonged completely to her. The week after she brought Everett the pie, Clara went back. Not because she'd decided to, not because she'd planned it out or talked herself into it. She was coming back from the feed store, and her wagon got stuck in a mud hole on the South Ridge Road, and Everett happened to be riding past on a big roan horse. He got off without being asked. He tied the horse to a fence post, rolled his sleeves up over his forearms, and put his shoulder into the back axle without a word. You don't have. She started. I know, he said. The wheel came free. He straightened up, looked at the mud on his shirt, and shrugged the way a man shrugs when he's spent his whole life getting dirty, and has never once expected anyone to feel bad about it. "Thank you," Clara said. "Wagon's too heavy for that road when it's wet," he said. "You'll want to take the ridge route when there's been rain." "I know that road. It adds 40 minutes. 40 minutes is better than stuck." She looked at him. He wasn't lecturing her. He was just saying a true thing the way people say true things when they're talking to someone they actually respect. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He untied his horse. She drove on. That was all. But the following Tuesday she arrived home to find that someone had laid fresh gravel along the worst section of the South Ridge Road, the part that always turned to paste in the rain. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew. She stood at the edge of her porch and looked down the road toward Black Pine Ridge and felt something happen inside her that she immediately tried to stop. She put a name to it so she could manage it: gratitude. Just gratitude. Nothing more complicated than that. She was very good at lying to herself. "He's different," said Mrs. Hatch, leaning over the fence with her arms folded in the particular way she folded them when delivering information she'd already decided was a verdict. "My Leonard says he doesn't talk much at the feed store. Just buys what he needs and leaves." "That sounds like a man who knows what he wants," Clara said, turning compost in her garden. "Or a man with something to hide. Most people have something to hide, Eleanor." "I'd worry more about the ones who don't." Mrs. Hatch's eyes narrowed. She had the look of a woman recalibrating a conversation that was going differently than she'd planned. "You've been over there. I brought him a welcome pie." "I know you did. Half the town knows you did." "Good," Clara said. "Then they also know he's a neighbor, and I was being neighborly, and there's nothing more to say about it." "Clara Bellamy, you cannot afford—" "I know what I can and cannot afford, Eleanor." She kept her voice pleasant. "That was the thing about living quietly. For long enough you got very good at being pleasant when you were angry. I appreciate your concern, I really do. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to get this finished before it rains." Mrs. Hatch left the way she always left, not gone exactly, but repositioned to a safer location where she could continue observing. Clara didn't care about the gossip. She'd stopped caring about the gossip long before her husband died. She cared about it even less after. Because you learn something useful about what people think of you when you become a widow, and discover that some of them are more concerned about who you might become available to than they are about how you're grieving. What she cared about was this: she was starting to look forward to things again. She was starting to look forward to the South Road, and the smoke from the cabin chimney, and the particular way Everett Callahan spoke to her directly, with no performance attached to it. He never softened things to make her feel better. He never said more than he meant. It reminded her of something. She couldn't quite place it. The third week of October, Everett came to her door. She opened it and found him standing on her porch, holding a broken fence post, and looking like a man who had talked himself into something he wasn't sure about. "I was fixing your south fence," he said, "and 2 more posts are rotting through." "I wanted to ask before I did more." She looked at the post. Then at him. "You were fixing my fence without asking?" "I noticed it was going while I was riding past. Started in on it before I thought better." He paused. "That was presumptuous. I'm sorry, I didn't say it was presumptuous. I said you didn't ask. I'm asking now." She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him for a moment. He didn't flinch. He just looked back at her with those tired, careful gray eyes that always seemed to be telling the truth even when he wasn't saying anything. "How many posts?" she said. 7, maybe 8. "I can't pay you." "I didn't ask to be paid." "Why?" He paused again. He was a man who paused a lot. She'd noticed, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was making sure he meant it. "Because you brought me pie when you didn't have to," he said finally. "And because your fence is falling down, and winter's coming, and it's the right thing to do." Clara was quiet for a moment. "There's dried apple cake on the windowsill if you want it when you're done," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "That'll do." She watched him walk back toward the fence line. She turned back into her kitchen and stood very still for a moment, her hands flat on the countertop, breathing steadily. "Do not," she told herself. "Do not do this. You know better than this." But the truth was, and she was only honest with herself, when the house was empty, it was already happening. Some slow, stubborn thing was already happening in her that she didn't know how to stop. Because he talked to her like she was someone worth talking to. And she had forgotten completely and utterly how much that meant. It was not until the third time they sat together at her kitchen table that it happened. He had come back to check one of the new fence posts it had heaved overnight with the freeze, and she'd asked him in because the coffee was already on. They'd been talking about horses. He had a calm roan he called Beaumont that clearly loved him more than it respected him, and Clara had been asking about the horse's history when she got up to pour more coffee and knocked her book off the table. It was a journal, her own, the one she sometimes wrote in when the letters felt like too little. He picked it up. He didn't open it. He wasn't that kind of man. But he held it for a moment, and his hand stopped moving, and something shifted in his face in a way she almost missed. "You're a writer," he said. "I write letters, mostly," she said. "And sometimes journals. I always have. It's just how I make sense of things." "What kind of letters?" Oh, she paused, taking the journal from him gently. "To my sister in Ohio, mostly. And I've had a correspondence going for a couple of years with," she stopped. "With someone I started writing to by accident. It doesn't matter." He looked at her very carefully. "By accident, it's a long story." He was quiet. "Do you write letters?" she asked, to change the subject. "I used to," he said, "to someone. Not anymore?" He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "The letters still go," he said. "I don't know if they still reach the right person." Clara felt something pull in her chest that she didn't examine. "I'm sure they do," she said. He said nothing. Outside, the wind moved through the fence posts he'd set. The coffee cooled. The letter came from W. 4 days later. It was the last letter that arrived before she found out the truth. She didn't know that then. She only knew it was longer than usual, 6 pages. Written late, she could tell from the way the penmanship loosened toward the end. He wrote about settling somewhere for the first time in years. About a place that felt like it might be real. About a woman he'd met who was kind in a way that felt very familiar to him, and how that familiarity frightened him more than any trail or storm he'd ever ridden through. He wrote, "I have never been very good at staying. But I think I'm learning that the reason for that isn't that I don't want to stay. It's that there was never anything that made staying feel possible. I don't know if that's changed, but I think about the possibility of it changing. I find myself thinking about it more than I used to." W. Clara read the letter at her kitchen table, with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She thought about her neighbor to the north. Then she made herself stop thinking about him. She wrote back W that night, "I think the problem with staying has never been the place. I think it's always been about whether the place has room for who you actually are, not who it wants you to be. I hope you found a place with room, Clara." She sealed the letter. She walked it to the post office the next morning. She never once thought to wonder why, when she'd sat down to write it, the face that had come into her mind wasn't the imagined face of a man she'd never met. It was the face of a man with tired gray eyes who looked at her like she was worth looking at. The community gathering came at the end of October. It was held every autumn in the back room of Mercer's saloon, which doubled as the only space in Willow Creek large enough to fit most of the town. There were tables along the walls, with food people had brought from home. A fiddle player named Cobb was setting up in the corner. There were children underfoot, and men standing in clusters near the back, and women managing everything without being thanked. Clara came alone, as she always did. She brought a bread pudding with whiskey sauce, and set it on the table and stood near the door, and wondered how long she needed to stay before leaving was acceptable. She was good at being present without taking up space. It was a skill she'd spent most of her adult life perfecting. Everett arrived 20 minutes after she did. She noticed him the moment he came in, which she was not happy about. He stood at the edge of the room, looking at the crowd with the expression of a man who had walked into a trap, and was being very calm about it. His shirt was clean, he'd shaved. He held his hat with both hands and turned it slowly. Someone introduced him to Sheriff Bradley. Clara watched him shake hands. Watched him answer questions with short, careful answers. Watched him scan the room in the particular way men did when they were mapping exits. His gaze found her. She looked away first. She busied herself with pouring a cup of punch she didn't want, and was halfway through the fiction of drinking it when she felt someone standing beside her. "You look like a woman who came here out of obligation," Everett said. She looked at him. "And you look like a man who'd rather be somewhere with fewer people." "Fewer by about 40, he agreed. She smiled. She hadn't meant to, but there it was. "Why did you come?" she asked. "Figured I ought to introduce myself properly." "You can only be the mysterious stranger for so long before it becomes a problem." He looked around the room. "Though I think 45 minutes is probably enough introducing." "Did you try the bread pudding?" "No. That's mine." "You should try it." He looked at her. "Then I will." They stood together near the wall for a while, not talking much, not performing for the room, just existing beside each other in a way that felt, to Clara, dangerously comfortable. Later in the evening, someone asked her to read. It was something she occasionally did at these gatherings, not often, and never willingly, but the community had learned that she wrote well, and sometimes asked her to share something. She always refused 3 times before agreeing, which was the proper etiquette. This time she agreed after the second ask. She read a poem she had written the previous winter. She'd written it after receiving one of W's letters, the one where he'd written about the gray mare named Rosie, and the way she could sense a storm. The poem was about knowing things before they happened, about the particular intelligence of animals, and the particular blindness of people. She read it in her plain, even voice. She didn't perform it. She just said the words. Halfway through, she noticed that Everett had stopped moving. He was standing with one hand on the wall and his coffee cup partway to his mouth, and he was completely still, in the way of so still when they've heard something that has reached the part of them they usually keep locked. She finished the poem. The room applauded. She sat down. She didn't look at him again. But later, much later, after most of the town had gone home, and she was pulling on her coat near the door, she heard him behind her. "Clara," she turned. He was looking at her in a way he hadn't looked at her before. It wasn't the same careful, measured look she'd come to expect from him. It was something else underneath it now, something that looked like recognition so deep it had become disorienting. "That poem," he said. "What about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said at last. "It was very good." She buttoned her coat. "Good night, Everett." "Good night, Clara." She walked home in the cold. She walked the whole 1.5 miles thinking about the way he'd said her name. And far away, in the saddlebag hanging from a nail by his door, 47 letters written in the same plain, unhurried handwriting waited in the dark. And the man who had written back to every single one of them stood alone in an empty room, and finally completely understood what he had done. He had lived a mile from her the entire time, and she still didn't know. Everett Callahan did not sleep that night. He lay on his bedroll with his arm across his eyes and listened to the wind work its way through the gaps in the cabin walls and told himself to be reasonable. To think clearly, to be the kind of man who assessed a situation before he acted on it. He had been telling himself that for 2 years. He reached over in the dark and pulled his saddlebag close. He didn't need to open it. He knew every letter in there by weight, by position, by the particular feel of the paper, some letters thin and practical, some thick with pages. All of them worn along the folds from being read too many times by a man who had convinced himself it was only correspondence. Clara Bellamy, the woman who had brought him pie, the woman who had gravel laid on the South Road and thought he didn't know she'd noticed. The woman who had stood in a room full of people and read words that had come directly from one of his letters. He was certain of it. Completely and sickeningly certain, and had no idea she was reading them back to the man who had first put them into the world. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead and breathed. The logical thing was simple. He needed to tell her. He had needed to tell her from the moment he opened his door 3 weeks ago and saw the handwriting on that note and felt the ground go unstable beneath his feet. He had known from the first cup of coffee, from the first sentence she spoke about knowing where people had been, that this was her. That the voice in the letters were the same thing. That the woman sitting at his table was the woman he had spent 2 years writing to in the dark. He had said nothing. He had told himself he was waiting for the right moment. But the truth in Everett was a man who eventually got to the truth, even when it took a long time. The truth was that he was afraid. Not of telling her, of what she would see when he told her. Because Clara didn't know about his past yet. She didn't know about the land company he'd worked for, or the families he hadn't helped when he should have, or the men who were currently looking for him with the kind of patience that only came from old scores and long memories. She thought he was a quiet cowboy who had come from Kansas. The moment she knew the truth about who he was, everything would change. And he had found, somewhere between that first cup of coffee and last night's gathering, that he did not want things to change. That was the most frightening thing of all. He got up before dawn and went to work. Clara spent the morning after the gathering doing what she always did when her mind was giving her trouble. She worked. She fed the chickens. She repaired a section of wire mesh on the coop where something had been getting through. She turned soil in the kitchen garden, even though the ground was cold enough to make her fingers ache. She carried 3 loads of firewood from the shed to the porch. She worked until the thoughts thinned out. Then she sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee and looked at nothing in particular and thought about a man standing very still with a cup partway to his mouth, listening to her read. She was not going to think about it. She thought about it anyway. The thing that disturbed her, she could at least be honest about being disturbed, even if she wasn't going to be honest about why was the look on his face. Not admiration exactly. Not the polite attention people gave when you read something at a gathering. It was something more specific than that. Something that looked like shock being held very carefully in place by a man who was practiced at holding things in place. She had seen that look once before, on his face the first day. When he'd read her note, she set that thought down deliberately. She did not pick it back up. The letter from W was still on her kitchen table, waiting for a reply she'd already written. She needed to walk it to the post office. She would do that this morning. She would not think about tired gray eyes, or the way a certain man's voice went rough at the edges when he was saying something he actually meant. She picked up the letter, she put on her coat, she walked to town. Harrison Vale was standing outside the general store when Clara came through Willow Creek. She knew Harrison Vale, the way everyone in town knew him, as the kind of man who was important enough that you had to acknowledge him, but careful enough about his importance that he never said anything that could be held against him directly. He owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, had 3 ranch hands who did his talking for him when talking wasn't polite, and had a way of looking at people that made you feel like he was calculating something. He tipped his hat at Clara. She nodded back and kept walking. Mrs. Bellamy, he said, stepping smoothly into a position that wasn't quite blocking her way but required her to stop or be rude. She stopped. Mr. Vale, I heard you've been spending some time with the new man out at Harmon's old place. I brought him a welcome pie, she said, same as I do for any new neighbor. Of course. His smile was pleasant, the way a locked door is pleasant smooth surface, nothing visible behind it. You know much about him? Where he came from, who he's worked for? I know he's my neighbor, Clara said. Is there something you needed, Mr. Vale? Just looking out for the community. He shrugged with one shoulder, easy and practiced. Man shows up with no references, no land of his own, no clear reason for settling here. It's natural to be curious. Natural, she agreed. And yet you managed to settle here without anyone asking you those questions, as I recall. His smile didn't waver, but something behind it shifted almost imperceptibly. You're a careful woman, Mrs. Bellamy, he said. I've always respected that about you. I'd just hate to see that carefulness taken advantage of. Thank you for the concern, Clara said. Good morning, Mr. Vale. She walked past him. She didn't look back. But her hands had tightened around the letter in her coat pocket, and she walked the rest of the way to the post office with the distinct and unpleasant feeling that something had just begun that she didn't yet have a name for. She slipped the letter through the post office slot and walked home. She was halfway back when she heard hoofbeats behind her, and Everett pulled his roan alongside her on the road. "You walk to town," he said. "I had a letter to post." He swung down from the horse without being asked, which she was starting to recognize as simply how he operated. He fell into step beside her, leading Beaumont by the reins. The horse was enormous and walked with a kind of dignified laziness that Clara found immediately likable. "You didn't take the wagon," he said. "It was just a letter." "It's cold a coat." He glanced at her sideways. "You talked to Harrison Vale." She looked at him sharply. "Were you watching? I came through town about 10 minutes behind you." Vale was standing in the same spot, looking like a man who'd just finished a conversation. He paused. "He say something about me?" She considered lying. "Briefly. He asked if I knew much about where you came from," she said. "Who you'd worked for." Everett said nothing for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "That you were my neighbor, and I'd brought you a pie." She looked at him directly. "Is there something I should know, Everett?" And there it was, the pause. The particular pause that she'd catalogued by now as the one that meant he was deciding something, not stalling. He wasn't the kind of man who stalled. "There are things in my past," he said carefully, "that I'm not proud of. I've been working my way clear of them, but they follow a man." "What kind of things?" "The kind that other men use to build accusations, whether or not those accusations are true." Clara kept walking. She watched the road in front of her. She thought about W's last letter, "I have never been very good at staying," and the careful way he'd written about a place that finally felt possible. "Are you dangerous?" she asked. "No, have you hurt people?" "I stood by when I should have stood in front of them," he said. "That's a different thing, but it's not a better one." She nodded slowly. "Vale is going to cause trouble," she said. It wasn't a question, probably. "Do you know why?" Everett looked at her steadily. "Because I know things about his land operations that he would prefer stayed buried. And because I'm not the kind of man who stays buried when he's asked to." Clara was quiet for the rest of the walk back. When they reached her gate, she stopped and turned to him. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I didn't tell you everything." "I know," she looked at him carefully, "but you told me the part that mattered." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded and swung back up onto Beaumont and rode north without another word. Clara went inside. She stood in her kitchen for a long time, not doing anything, just standing in the particular kind of stillness that comes when you realize a situation you thought was one thing has quietly become another. The letter from W arrived 6 days later. She knew before she opened it that it was going to be one of the long ones. The envelope was thick, and he'd sealed it twice, which he only did when he'd written something he'd considered not sending. She opened it at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. "Clara, I have been sitting here for 3 hours trying to decide whether to write this or throw it in the stove. I'm going to write it and let you decide what to do with it. I need to tell you something about myself that I have not told anyone in a long time. Not because I'm proud of it, because I think you deserve to know who you've been writing to. Several years ago, I worked for a man who owned large tracts of land in southern Wyoming. I was brought on to manage cattle transport. I'm good at that, always have been, and I didn't ask too many questions about how the operation was run, because the pay was steady and I was tired. That was my first mistake. Tired men stop asking questions. Tired men tell themselves things are simpler than they are. The operation was forcing families off their land. Legal in the letter of it, criminal in the spirit. I found out when a woman came to the camp gate with her 2 children and asked me, personally, because I was the man who looked least like the others, whether anyone was going to help her. I said I would look into it. I looked into it, and then I didn't do anything because I was afraid of what standing up would cost me. She lost the farm. I left 3 weeks later, too late to matter. I've been running from that ever since, not from the law. I didn't break the law, technically. Just from myself, from the knowledge of what I didn't do when it would have counted. I'm telling you this because you asked me once what I was most ashamed of, and I said I'd tell you when I was ready. I'm telling you now. I don't know what you'll think of me after this. I think you'll be honest about it, which is the thing I'm most afraid of. You've never been anything but honest. Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it down and sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. You know what I think about? The woman who came to your gate with her children. She didn't come to the man in charge. She came to you. Because you were the one who looked like he might actually listen. She was right. You did listen. You just didn't act, and you've been punishing yourself for it ever since, which I suppose is its own kind of sentence. I'm not going to tell you what you did was fine. It wasn't fine. You know that better than I do. But I will tell you this, the man who didn't act back then is clearly not the same man who wrote me this letter. Growth is slow and mostly invisible, and only shows up in things like writing 6 pages to someone you've never met and admitting things you've been carrying alone for years. That's not a small thing. Write me back when you're ready. I'll be here, Clara. She sealed the letter and put it aside to post in the morning. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Because the things W. had written about the land operation, the families, the men who were patient about old scores they matched, precisely and completely, everything Everett had told her on the road that afternoon. She told herself it was a coincidence. She told herself there were many cowboys with difficult pasts in the American West in the year 1887, and it would be remarkable if they didn't overlap in certain ways. She told herself this for approximately 20 minutes before she stopped being able to believe it. Then she lay in the dark and thought about the way he'd gone still when she read the poem, and the way he'd looked at her note on the first day, and the way he'd said, "That afternoon I didn't tell you everything." And she thought about 47 letters in a wooden box beneath her bed. And she thought about a saddlebag hanging from a nail beside a cabin door, buckled very carefully on a shelf with a bundle of papers tied with red string. And she thought no, and then she thought, but what if? And then she didn't sleep at all. She did not go to his cabin the next day or the day after. She posted the letter, came home, and did the work of a woman who had a farm to run, and no time for the particular kind of spiral she was currently trying to manage. On the third day, Everett came to her. He knocked at the door, and when she opened it, he was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had also not slept in a while. Though she was not going to say that. "I have something I need to tell you," he said. Her heart did something she ignored. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood in her kitchen, not sitting, which she understood meant whatever this was. He needed to be able to move if it went badly. "Say it," she said quietly. He looked at her. "There's something I knew," he said, "that I should have told you from the beginning, and I didn't tell you, because I was afraid of what it would mean, and that was wrong of me. And I need to tell you now." "All right, the note you put on the pie," he said. "Your handwriting," Clara went very still. "I recognized it," Everett said. "I've seen it for 2 years. Every letter you've written." He stopped. "Try it again. I'm W. Clara." The kitchen was absolutely silent. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then, because Clara Bellamy had spent her whole life being a practical woman who dealt with the truth directly and without decoration, she said, "I know." He blinked. "When did you? 3 nights ago," she said. "After I read your last letter," he exhaled a long and shaky breath. "Then you understand why." I understand why," she said. "That doesn't mean it was right." "No," he said, "it wasn't." She turned away from him. She moved to the counter, put her hands flat on the surface, looked at the window. "I've been writing to you for 2 years," she said, and her voice was steady but tight. "I told you things I have never told another living person. Things about being alone, about being that." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "About what it feels like to move through the world in this body and have people decide what I'm worth before I've said a word. I told you those things because I trusted that you were a stranger, that you were safe, that you would never look at me and know." "Clara, and you've been sitting here," she said. "A mile from my house." "Knowing, yes," he said. "I know how that sounds." "Do you?" "It sounds like a man who found out something extraordinary happened and was too afraid to ruin it by being honest." He paused. That's exactly what it was. She turned around. His face was open in a way she had not seen it before, none of the careful management, none of the measured distance. Just a man standing in her kitchen, looking at her with something that was very close to asking for something, and also very certain he had no right to ask. "I never lied to you," he said in any letter. "Everything I wrote was true." "I know that," she said. "I know your letters, Everett. Better than I know almost anything. Then you know what you mean to me." The words landed quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. "I need time," she said. "I know." She stopped. Looked at her hands. "I'm not saying no, I'm saying I need to think." He nodded once. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door and put his hand on the frame and turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "the letters were already the most important thing in my life. Before I knew your face, before I knew you lived a mile away. Just the letters, just you. That was already true before any of this started." He left. Clara stood in her kitchen for a very long time. Then she went to her room and pulled the wooden box from beneath her bed and opened it and took out the letters, all 47 of them, and laid them on the quilt in the order they'd arrived. She began to read. She was not looking for romance. She was not looking for comfort. She was looking for who he was, the real shape of him, stripped of the face and the voice and the tired gray eyes that she had already, without permission, started to depend on. She read for 3 hours, and what she found, underneath every word he'd ever written, was a man who had spent 2 years being more honest with her than he had ever been with anyone. A man who had told her in writing that she deserved to be seen. A man who had written once, in a letter she had memorized, "I think about you when I'm somewhere particularly beautiful, and I want to tell someone about it. You're the only one I want to tell." A man who was W. Who was also Everett, who was a mile away, and who was, whatever else he was, the person who had kept her company through the longest and loneliest years of her life. She put the letters back in the box. She sat with her hands in her lap for a while. Then she got up, put on her coat, and walked north. He was in the barn when she arrived, working on something with Beaumont's harness by lamplight. He heard her come in and turned and immediately went very still. "I'm not here to forgive you yet," Clara said. "I want to be clear about that." "Understood," he said. "I'm here because I've been thinking, and I realize there's something important that needs to be said." He set down the harness. "Harrison Vale," she said. "He came to find you for a reason, and if he's looking, he's already been working on whatever he's planning. That letter you wrote me about what you knew, what you left, Vale knows you left, because of what you saw. Doesn't he?" Something shifted in Everett's expression from personal to alert, fast. "Yes," he said. "Then he's going to move soon, 'cause you settling here, becoming known, becoming someone people trust, that's a problem for him." "I know. Then we need to think," Clara said. He looked at her. "You said we. Don't make a fuss about it." The corner of his mouth moved. "No, ma'am," he said. She pulled out the short 3-legged stool near the barn door and sat on it, folded her hands and looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was about to be relentlessly practical. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start at the beginning and don't leave out the parts that are embarrassing." Everett Callahan looked at the woman who had read his letters, walked a mile in the cold, and was now sitting on a barn stool ready to help him outthink a man who had been outmaneuvering people for years. He pulled up a feed bucket. He sat down. He told her everything. It took a long time, and outside, somewhere between the South Farm and the ridge, the first snow of the season began to fall soft and unhurried, covering the road between 2 houses that had always been close enough to matter. He told her everything in the order it happened, which was not the order she might have expected. He started not with the land company, not with Wyoming, not with the families or the foremen or the long list of things he should have done differently. He started with his father. "My father worked cattle his whole life," Everett said. "Never owned a piece of land, always worked someone else's. He believed that if you were honest and you worked hard, eventually it evened out. That the world had a kind of fairness built into it that would show up if you were patient enough." He paused. "He died broke at 53, still waiting for it to show up." Clara said nothing. She listened the way she did everything completely, without performing it. I swore I wouldn't do the same thing, he said. So when Garrison Vale's brother offered me steady work in Wyoming managing cattle transport, I took it. Good money, real money. And I told myself it didn't matter that something felt off about the operation, because feeling off isn't the same as knowing something's wrong. He looked at his hands. That's what I told myself, but you knew, Clara said quietly. I suspected, he said, which is worse in its way. Because suspecting means you made a choice to keep suspecting instead of looking. He told her about the families then, about the documents he'd seen being signed under conditions that weren't exactly coercion, but weren't exactly free either. About the surveyor who'd come through and remapped boundary lines that had stood for 20 years. About the woman at the gate with her children, whose name was Margaret Freed and whose face he had not forgotten in 7 years. I left 3 weeks after she came to the gate, he said. I thought leaving was the same as refusing. It isn't. Leaving just means the thing keeps happening without you. And Harrison Vale, Clara said, his brother ran the Wyoming operation. Harrison ran a smaller version of the same scheme here in Montana. Different families, same methods. When I came through the valley last spring and recognized what he was doing, he stopped. I should have kept riding, but you didn't. No, he looked at her steadily. I didn't. Clara stood up from the stool and paced once slowly, which he had learned was how she thought. How much do you know about his operation specifically, she asked. Enough to be dangerous to him. Names, dates, land records? Some of it, not all. But he doesn't know how much you know. No, Everett said. He knows I worked with his brother. He knows I left when I shouldn't have stayed quiet about why. He doesn't know what I saw or what I kept. Clara stopped pacing. What did you keep, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Letters, he said. She looked at him. Not to you, he said quickly. Business letters, correspondence I copied before I left. Notes from conversations I wrote down afterward, dated, signed with my name. I kept them because I thought someday someone might need them. He exhaled. I've been carrying them for 7 years. Where are they? In my saddlebag. Clara looked at the saddlebag hanging from the nail by the cabin door, the one she'd noticed on the first visit, buckled too carefully for a man who kept everything else simple. Everett, she said, I know. Those letters could clear you completely. They could also get me killed if the wrong people know I have them, before the right people see them. The barn went very quiet. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and indifferent to the fact that 2 people inside a lamplight barn were sitting with something that had just become much larger than either of them. Then we need to be careful, Clara said, and we need to be faster than he is. We, Everett said again. She looked at him with a direct, patient expression that said she'd already addressed this word once and didn't intend to address it again. Yes, she said, we. 3 days later, Harrison Vale made his first move. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about Vale, he didn't do dramatic, because dramatic left evidence. He did quiet, he did incremental. He did the kind of damage that looked, from a distance, like coincidence. A horse went missing from Everett's small corral. Not Beaumont, the roan was too recognizable, too attached to Everett in the visible way working horses got attached to their riders. A younger horse, a bay mare Everett had acquired in town 2 weeks prior. Gone between dusk and dawn, the corral gate left carefully unlatched to suggest it had simply swung open. Sheriff Bradley came out to take a report with the expression of a man who was not sure this was worth his morning. Could have wandered, Bradley said, looking at the corral gate. She's a barn horse, Everett said. She doesn't wander. Horses do things you don't expect. Everett looked at the sheriff with the quiet patience of a man who has spent a long time dealing with officials who prefer the simpler explanation. The gate latch has a gravity catch. It doesn't swing open. Someone lifted it. Bradley wrote something in his notebook. He did not look particularly troubled by what he wrote. He left with the assurance that he would look into it, which they both understood to mean that he would not look into it unless something considerably larger happened. Everett stood at the corral fence after Bradley's horse disappeared down the road and felt the particular cold of knowing that what was coming was not going to be settled by a sheriff who preferred simple explanations. He heard Clara's wagon before he saw it. She pulled up, looked at the empty corral, looked at him. "The mare," she said. "Last night, she tied her wagon horse and climbed down and came to stand beside him at the corral fence, and she looked at the empty space where the bay mare had stood, and she said nothing for a moment." "Bradley was here," Everett said. "What did he say?" "That horses wander." Clara made a small sound that was not quite a word but communicated exactly what she thought of that. "This is how it starts," Everett said. "Small things first. Things that don't look like anything. Then the small things become a pattern. Then the pattern becomes a story, and by the time the story is established, people believe it even if they can't point to any single thing that proves it." "He's building a reputation for you," Clara said. "Before I can build one for myself," he turned to look at her. "Clara, I want you to be careful. Whatever Vale is planning, he's going to use whatever he can find. And you've been seen with me. I know that. I'm not sure you understand what I mean." She looked at him directly. "I understand exactly what you mean, Everett. I'm a large widow who lives alone and who has now twice been seen in extended conversation with a man Vale wants to discredit. He'll use me too if he can find a way to. He'll make whatever is between us into something small and pitiful to take away any credibility I might have." She paused. "I've been navigating that kind of thing since my husband died. Don't worry about my understanding of it." He looked at her. "I wasn't trying to insult you," he said. "I know you weren't. I'm telling you not to protect me from information I can use." She held his gaze. "Where are the letters, Everett? The business ones?" "Still in the saddlebag. They need to move, I know." "I can keep them," she said. "Nobody's going to search a widow's farmhouse without cause, and Vale doesn't have cause where I'm concerned." "Not yet." He shook his head, slow and firm. "I'm not putting that risk on you." "It's not your risk to give or withhold," Clara said. "It's mine, and I'm choosing to take it." She looked at him with that plain level look that he had come to understand meant she had already made the decision and was now simply informing him of it. "Let me help you. Actually help you. Not because I'm in love with you or because I feel sorry for you, but because what Vale is doing is wrong and I know it's wrong, and I have the ability to do something about it." "That's enough reason." He stood there. She waited. "All right," he said at last. She nodded once. "Good. Now go get the letters." She kept them in the wooden box. Her box, the one with W's letters. She put the business correspondence in an envelope and slipped it beneath the stack of personal letters and closed the lid and slid the box back under her bed. And she was aware, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, that there was something fitting about the evidence of who he'd been and the evidence of who he was living in the same place, separated only by an envelope and 47 pages of two people telling each other the truth. She did not tell him where she'd put them. Some things a woman kept to herself. The second move came 4 days later, and it was worse than the first. Eli Marsh rode into Willow Creek on a Tuesday morning and went directly to the sheriff's office. Eli Marsh was a man in his 40s with the look of someone who had been well paid to have a specific kind of memory. He told Bradley that he had been present, 3 years prior, when a man named Everett Callahan had deliberately destroyed a supply depot outside Laramie. Wyoming burned it to the ground to avoid paying a debt. There was no such event, but Eli Marsh had a sworn statement. And 2 men who had ridden in with him had corroborating statements. Clara heard about it from Mrs. Hatch, who had heard it from the postmaster, who had been in the sheriff's office when Marsh arrived. She heard it within 2 hours of the statement being filed, which was how small towns worked. Information moved faster than horses. She went directly to Everett. He was at his workbench in the barn, and she could tell from the way he was holding the harness he'd been working on. Too still, too tight that he had already heard. "Eli Marsh," she said. "I know him," Everett said. "He set the harness down. He worked for Vale's brother in Wyoming." "Which means Vale brought him in specifically. He's filed a statement with Bradley." "I know. Bradley's going to have to act on it. I know that too." He stood up. "Clara, I want you to go home." "I won't. This is about to become something a lot bigger than a missing horse." "I understand that. Then you understand I can't let you." "What?" She stepped forward, and there was nothing gentle about her voice now. You can't let me what? Be involved? I'm already involved. The moment I brought you that pie, I was involved. The moment I put those letters under my bed, I was involved. You do not get to decide now, when things are getting difficult, that my involvement is no longer acceptable. She stopped. Looked at him steadily. I'm not going anywhere, Everett. So stop trying to send me away and start thinking about what we do next. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in him, some last resistance, some final piece of the careful distance he'd kept, came down quietly, like a fence post releasing its last grip in frozen ground. There's a judge, he said. Regional circuit. His name is Alderman. He's been looking into land fraud cases across 3 counties. He's not Vale's man. How do you know? Because Vale's tried to get him removed twice and failed both times. He paused. If we can get the business letters to Alderman before this hearing happens. When is the hearing? Bradley will call it within the week, based on a sworn statement. Clara did the arithmetic quickly. That's not enough time to reach a circuit judge and get word back. Not by mail, Everett said. But there's a man named Cole Garrett who rides between here and Billings twice a week for the stage company. He knows me. He's trustworthy. Can he get word to Alderman? He can get a message to Alderman's clerk. Whether Alderman acts on it in time is... He stopped. Is what? Is something we can't control, he said. And I've never been good at things I can't control. Neither have I, Clara said, but we do it anyway. She met his gaze. He nodded. I'll find Cole tonight, he said. Good. She turned to go, then stopped. Everett. He looked at her. What? Marsh said the supply depot. The debt. None of it is true. It was not quite a question. No, he said, none of it is true. She nodded once. She left. She did not look back, which was how he knew she believed him, because she wasn't looking for confirmation in his face. She'd already decided. That was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen anyone do for him. What neither of them knew yet was that Eli Marsh was not the only piece Harrison Vale had moved onto the board. The second piece arrived that same evening, and it arrived not at the sheriff's office or the saloon or any public place where it could be tracked and countered. It arrived at Clara's gate. A woman she didn't recognize was standing at the end of her path when Clara got home, mid-40s, travel-worn, with the particular expression of someone who has been given a job she isn't proud of but needs the money. Mrs. Bellamy, the woman said. Yes, my name is Ruth Sperry. I've been asked to deliver a message. By who? Ruth Sperry hesitated. Mr. Vale suggested that it might be in your interest, she said carefully, to consider the nature of your association with Mr. Callahan. He suggested that a woman in your position, a widow, alone with a farm to maintain, might benefit from the goodwill of established members of the community. And that goodwill, he said, can be a fragile thing. Clara stood at her gate and looked at Ruth Sperry. Ruth Sperry, to her credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable. He's threatening me, Clara said. He didn't use that word. He didn't need to. She looked at the woman directly. Is that the whole message? He also said. Ruth stopped. Looked away, looked back. He said that a woman like you should be careful about how much faith you places in a man who sees her as convenient. That landed. Clara felt it land, felt the precise way it was designed to land, aimed at the specific doubt that any woman in her position would carry. The doubt that said, maybe he's only here because you're useful. Maybe what feels like being seen is just being used again. She breathed, one breath slow through the cold November air. Tell Mr. Vale, Clara said, that I appreciate his concern for my welfare. And that I will be as careful about his warnings as he's been about the truth. Ruth Sperry blinked. Tell him exactly that, Clara said pleasantly. Word for word, she went inside. She stood in her kitchen. She put her hands flat on the counter and breathed steadily, and did not allow herself to spiral, because spiraling was what Vale wanted, and she had never once in her life given someone what they wanted by falling apart. But the word sat in her chest like a splinter, a man who sees her as convenient. She had felt that before. Had spent years feeling it, the particular vulnerability of being a large woman who wasn't supposed to expect desire or devotion or genuine attention, and therefore could trust it when it appeared. She had built careful walls around that vulnerability. had told herself she was practical, realistic, clear-eyed. And then a man with gray eyes had sat in her kitchen and talked to her like she was the most interesting person in the room. She pressed her lips together. She went to her bedroom. She pulled the wooden box from beneath the bed. She did not open it. She sat with her hand on the lid and thought about 47 letters, and about the fact that a man who used someone for convenience did not write 6 pages in the dark about the things he was most ashamed of. Did not ask nothing in return. Did not say in a letter she had memorized, "You are the only one I want to tell." She put the box back. She got up. She had work to do. Cole Garrett left for Billings the following morning before dawn, with a letter from Everett, a sealed envelope containing 2 of the most critical business documents, and instructions that he was to place them personally in the hands of Judge Alderman's clerk and wait for a written acknowledgement. He was a lean, weathered man of 50 who shook Everett's hand once and didn't ask unnecessary questions, which was exactly why Everett trusted him. Clara had come to see him off. She stood beside Everett on the cold road in the early dark and watched Cole's horse disappear into the gray morning, and then she stood for a moment in the quiet. "How long?" she said. 3 days if he pushes the hearing? Bradley came by yesterday evening. He's calling it for Friday. 3 days. Clara ran the arithmetic again and didn't like the result. "The remaining letters," she said. "The rest of the documents. We need someone else who can speak to what they contain. Someone credible, someone Vale hasn't gotten to." Everett was quiet. "There are ranchers," he said slowly. 2 families in the valley. The Rourkes and the Ashworths. Vale's been running the same pressure on them that his brother ran in Wyoming. They haven't said anything publicly because they're afraid. But they've seen things. Would they talk? I don't know. They might if they thought there was a real chance of Vale being stopped. If they thought speaking up wouldn't just make them a target with nobody to back them. Then that's what we need to show them, Clara said. That there's a real chance. She turned to look at him. "I'll go," she said, "to the Rourkes and the Ashworths." "Yes, Claire, I'm a woman alone who brings people pie," she said flatly. "Vale has not built a story about me yet. I'm not the threat he's managing. Which means I can move in places you can't right now without it looking like you're building a defense." He stared at her. "That's correct," she said. "I'll go this afternoon." "You stay visible. Go into town, buy something at the general store. Let people see you're not hiding." He stared for another moment. "You'd make a terrifying general," he said. "I'd make a terrifying anything," she said. "I've been underestimated my entire life." "I know exactly how useful that is," he almost smiled. Not quite. The situation was too tight for a real smile, but the thing that happened at the corner of his mouth was the nearest he could get. "Be careful," he said. "Always," she said. She was not always careful. But she was always smart, which was better. The Rourke family lived on a mid-sized cattle operation 8 miles east of town, run by a man named Donald Rourke who was somewhere around 60. Built like a man who had wrestled the land into submission for 4 decades and found the land a worthy opponent. His wife May was small and sharp-eyed, and had the look of a woman who had watched a great deal and said very little about most of it. Clara arrived in the early afternoon. Donald Rourke met her at the gate with the particular expression of a man who was both surprised and not entirely unwilling to see her. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "This is unexpected, I know," she said. "I apologize for not sending word ahead. May I come in?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the gate. May Rourke made coffee without being asked, which Clara took as a good sign. She sat at their kitchen table and she looked at both of them, and she decided in that moment to do the thing that always worked better than strategy. She told the truth. "Everett Callahan is my neighbor and my friend," she said. "He's a good man with a complicated past, and Harrison Vale is using that past to build a false case against him because Everett knows things about Vale's operation that could destroy it. You know what I'm talking about." May Rourke's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Donald Rourke's face went very still. "I'm not asking you to put yourselves in danger," Clara said. "I'm asking you to tell me what you've seen, and to think about whether you're willing to say it in front of a judge, if a judge gets involved." That's all. You don't have to decide now. But I need to know whether there's something to decide. Silence. Donald looked at May. May looked at her coffee cup. Then May said very quietly he had our eastern survey line redrawn. Last spring, without our knowledge. We didn't find out until the new surveyor's map came through the county office. Do you have the original survey documents? Clara said. We do, Donald said. Would you be willing to show them to a judge? Another silence. May looked up from her coffee cup. My father built this land, May said. His hands built every fence post and every outbuilding from the road to the ridge. Harrison Vale sat in his comfortable house and moved a line on a paper and took 40 acres of what my father built. She set her cup down. Yes, Mrs. Bellamy, I'll talk to a judge. Clara rode to the Ashworths next. It took less time. The Ashworth family's foreman, a man named Pete, met her at the barn door and told her that Jacob Ashworth had already been thinking about coming forward for 2 months and had only been waiting for someone else to move first. Tell him someone moved, Clara said. Pete nodded and went inside. By the time Clara pointed her wagon horse back toward Willow Creek, the sun was going down, and the temperature was dropping fast, and she had 2 families willing to speak to a judge, a man riding hard for Billings, and 3 days until Friday. It wasn't enough, but it was closer to enough than it had been this morning. She was 2 miles from town when she heard hoofbeats behind her, fast, purposeful, not casual riding. She kept her eyes forward and kept her pace steady, and listened to the hoofbeats close the distance. They came alongside her, 2 men. She didn't know their faces, but she knew the type, the hired kind, who had learned to deliver messages on horseback at dusk and not worry too much about what the recipient thought of the delivery method. Mrs. Bellamy, said the one on her left. Evening, she said pleasantly. Mr. Vale asks that you reconsider your activities today. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. Tell Mr. Vale, she said, in the same even, pleasant voice she'd used on Ruth Sperry, that I spent today visiting neighbors. Which is what people do. He knows who you visited. Clara's hands tightened on the reins. She did not let it show. Then he knows I had coffee with the Rourkes and a short conversation with the Ashworth's foreman, she said. All very ordinary. He knows what you were asking. She said nothing. He wanted you to know, said the man on her left, that there are consequences for people who interfere in things that don't concern them. And that a woman who lives alone on a farm outside town is what? Clara said. Her voice was still pleasant. Her voice was absolutely still. The man on her left heard something in it and stopped mid-sentence. Is very visible, he finished lamely. Thank you for the message, Clara said. Good evening. She did not look at them. She kept her horse at the same pace. She did not allow them the satisfaction of watching her hurry. They fell back. She drove the last 2 miles home in the cold dark and went inside and sat at her kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and allowed herself for exactly 2 minutes to feel the fear that she had refused to feel on the road. Then she stopped. She pulled out her writing paper. She wrote a brief note to Everett, sealed it, and went to the barn to saddle her horse. She rode to his cabin in the dark and slid the note under his door and turned around without knocking, because there was nothing to say that the note didn't say. The note said, Vale knows about the Rourkes and the Ashworths. He's watching my movements. He's not bluffing anymore. Rourkes and Ashworths will speak if we get them a judge. We need coal to reach Alderman Fast C. She rode home. She unsaddled her horse. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about Friday. 3 days. And Harrison Vale, who had never once underestimated anyone in his life, had just made the first mistake of his entire career. He had threatened her. He had made her afraid. And fear in Clara Bellamy had never once in 30 years produced retreat. It had produced something considerably more dangerous. It had produced absolute, quiet, immovable resolve. Wednesday came in cold and sharp, and Clara woke before dawn with the particular alertness of someone who has gone to sleep already thinking about what morning would demand. She dressed, fed the animals, made coffee, and stood at her kitchen window and thought about 3 things simultaneously: the hearing on Friday, the 2 days left before it arrived, and the fact that she had not heard from Everett since she'd slipped the note under his door. She had not expected to hear from him immediately. He was not a man who reacted to things immediately. He was a man who absorbed information, went quiet with it, and then moved usually decisively, usually in a direction you hadn't anticipated. But the silence by Wednesday morning was long enough to make her uneasy. She was still standing at the window with her second cup of coffee when she saw him coming down the south road on Beaumont, and the way he was riding fast, leaning forward. Not his usual measured pace told her before he even dismounted that something had changed. She opened the door before he knocked. He came in without preamble. "Cole got word back," he said. She put her cup down. "And Alderman is coming. He's rerouting his circuit. He'll be in Willow Creek by Thursday evening." Clara absorbed this. "That's less than 48 hours, she said. "Yes. Which means Vale has the same 48 hours to finish whatever he's building." "Yes," he looked at her steadily. "There's more. Cole talked to Alderman's clerk directly. The clerk told him that Alderman already has an open inquiry into land fraud in this county. He's been building a case for 4 months. He just needed someone inside the operation willing to produce documentation." The kitchen went very quiet. "You're not just a man with a false accusation against him," Clara said slowly. "You're a witness Alderman has been waiting for. That's what it appears. And Vale doesn't know, not yet." She looked at him. He looked at her. "This changes everything," she said. "It changes what's possible," he said carefully. "It doesn't change what Vale is going to try to do between now and Friday. If anything, he's going to push harder. He can feel the ground shifting even if he doesn't know why." As if to confirm it, Mrs. Hatch knocked on Clara's door 40 minutes later. Clara opened it and found her neighbor in her good visiting coat with her hands clasped in front of her, and the expression of a woman delivering news she had already decided was a verdict. "Clara," she said, with the kind of gentleness that carries a weapon behind it, "I heard something this morning that I felt you needed to know. About your Mr. Callahan. He's my neighbor Eleanor." "Of course." She didn't move. "You know there's a hearing Friday. You know about the accusations from the Wyoming man." "I'm aware. There's something else being said now, Mrs." Hatch hesitated, genuinely hesitated, which was unusual for her. "People are saying he has a history of targeting women alone. Widows, specifically, that it's a pattern." Clara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November air. "Who's saying it?" she said. It's just talk." "Talk started by whom, Eleanor?" Mrs. Hatch looked uncomfortable. "There was a man in the general store this morning. I didn't know him. He was talking to several people, and he said that he'd seen Callahan do this before in Colorado. A widow there, he said. Callahan worked his way into her confidence and then what? He didn't say exactly. He implied the woman lost money." Clara stood in her doorway and looked at her neighbor and felt the precise architecture of what Vale was doing, not just discrediting Everett for the hearing, but destroying him socially, personally, permanently. Building the kind of story that followed a man forever, regardless of what a judge decided. The kind of story people repeated for years, because it contained exactly the thing they were already half prepared to believe. And using her as the evidence, the convenient widow. The lonely large woman who had been too trusting. "Thank you for telling me, Eleanor," Clara said. She kept her voice completely even. "I'll look into it." She closed the door. She turned around. Everett was standing at her kitchen table, and she could tell from his face that he had heard every word through the door. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely stricken. Not afraid of Vale or of the hearing or of the false accusations, those things he could manage, because they were external. This was different, this was shame, and it sat on him visibly. "Clara, don't apologize," she said. "I was going to say you should know this is going to get worse before Friday. If you want to step back from this, I understand. I have never wanted your name attached to any of what's coming." She looked at him. She was quiet for exactly 1 moment. Then she said, "The only thing I want you to stop doing is saying things like that to me. Because every time you suggest I might step back, what I actually hear is that you still don't believe I know my own mind. And that is the one thing I am least patient about." He looked at her for a long moment. "Understood," he said. "Good." She moved to the table and sat down now. "Who is the man in the general store, and who sent him?" His name was Declan Crisp. Everett knew it the moment Clara described him: mid-40s, sharp-dressed for a frontier town, the kind of easy talker who could build a crowd around himself without seeming to try. He was in the Garrison Vale operation in Wyoming, Everett said. He wasn't a ranch hand, he was a fixer, the man they brought in when they needed a story to replace an inconvenient truth. "He's good at it, Clara, very good. He doesn't lie exactly. He takes real things and reframes them. In Colorado there was a widow. A woman named Dunbar. I did work on her property for 3 weeks after her fence line collapsed. She paid me in meals and trade. There was nothing else to it. But Crisp was in the area, and he watched it, and now he can say, truthfully, that he saw me on the property repeatedly, that money was involved in some form, and that the woman was alone. And the gap between what he saw and what he implies is exactly wide enough to ruin a reputation without being provable as a lie." Everett's jaw tightened. "He's done it before, to men who got in the way of the operation. It's cleaner than violence and harder to fight." Clara was quiet, thinking. "He'll be at the hearing Friday," she said. "Almost certainly. Then we need something he can't reframe." She looked at Everett. "The documents you gave Cole, what specifically do they show?" "Dates, names, payment records, correspondence between Vale and his brother outlining the survey manipulation strategy. 2 letters where Vale specifically references families he intends to pressure off their land by name." "The Rourkes?" Clara said sharply. "By name." Something moved through her expression, not quite fury, but the clean, clarifying thing that lives next to fury in people who know how to use it. "Does Alderman know what he's receiving?" Cole gave him the summary I wrote. Alderman's clerk sent back one line. He paused. It said, "Tell your man to be in the room Friday morning." "We've been waiting." Clara sat back. She looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at Everett. "We need to get the Rourkes and the Ashworths into that room," she said. "Not just willing to speak to a judge someday in the room Friday morning. That's 24 hours to convince 2 families to walk into a public hearing against the most powerful man in the county." "I know, Clara, I know," she said again. "I'll go this afternoon." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something that looked like it had run out of words. "You understand," he said, "that if this works, if Alderman rules against Vale on Friday, Vale is finished in this county. His operation, his reputation, everything. Men like that don't accept finished quietly." "I know, and the people who helped bring it about. We'll have the protection of a federal judge's record and 2 families who will remember what was done for them." She looked at him directly. "I know what I'm doing, Everett." He held her gaze. "I know you do," he said quietly. "That's what keeps me honest about how much I owe you." "You owe me nothing," she said. "I owe you everything," he said. The words were simple and precise and not dramatic, which was exactly how she knew he meant them completely. She looked away first. "I'll be back before dark," she said. The Rourkes agreed immediately. May Rourke had the original survey documents already pulled from her husband's desk by the time Clara arrived, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, as if she'd been waiting for someone to come ask for them. "I told Donald last night," May said, "that I'd been waiting 2 years for someone to walk through that gate who was actually going to do something. I was starting to think nobody was coming. Something's coming Friday morning," Clara said. "We'll be there," May said. She looked at her husband. He nodded once firmly, without needing to discuss it further. That was what a real partnership looked like. Clara thought 2 people who had gotten so far into the same life together that the decisions moved between them without requiring full sentences. She felt something ache quietly and moved past it. The Ashworths were harder, not because Jacob Ashworth was unwilling. He was willing, she could see it in the way he sat forward in his chair and in the way his hands were tight on his coffee cup. He was willing, but he was afraid, and fear in a man who has spent his whole life being responsible for other people is not the same as cowardice. It's wait. If Vale isn't stopped Friday, Jacob said slowly. If this judge doesn't rule the way you think he will, then I've stood up in a public room against a man who has the money and the connections to make my family's life very difficult for a very long time. That's true, Clara said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. She hadn't softened it. I won't tell you the risk isn't real, she said. It is. And I won't promise you that Alderman rules in our favor with certainty, because I don't know that for certain. What I know is that there are documents that show what Vale has done. There is a federal judge who has been building a case for 4 months and is writing to Willow Creek specifically because someone produced those documents. And there are 2 families, yours and the Rourkes, who have seen the same thing done to them and can speak to it. She paused. If you're in that room and Alderman hears your survey records alongside the documents Everett Callahan kept for 7 years, Vale is finished. If you're not in the room, the outcome is less certain, and whatever happens, you still live next to this man afterward. The kitchen was silent. Jacob Ashworth looked at his wife, a quiet woman named Susan, who had not spoken since Clara arrived. Susan was looking at her hands. Then Susan said, without looking up, my mother's family lost their land to a man like Vale. 60 years ago, she talked about it until she died. The way it happened so fast, the way nobody did anything. She looked up. We'll be there. Jacob looked at his wife. He nodded. We'll be there, he said. Clara drove home faster than she'd driven anywhere in months. Thursday arrived the way the worst days sometimes do, quietly, without drama, giving no indication of what it was carrying. Everett was at her door before 8 in the morning. Alderman is in town, he said, arrived late last night. He's at the hotel. Has he seen the documents? His clerk confirmed receipt. That's all I know. And the hearing is still Friday morning? 9 o'clock. Willow Creek Church. Bradley moved it from the saloon. He paused. More formal setting. Either Bradley's taking it more seriously than we thought, or someone told him to. Has Vale been seen? He came into town an hour ago. He had 4 men with him. Declan Crisp was one of them. Clara absorbed this. Is Eli Marsh still here? Still at the boarding house. So Vale has his witnesses in place, she thought. Does he know about Alderman? I don't know. He knows a regional judge is in town. Whether he's connected that to the hearing yet, Everett stopped. If he connects it, Clara said, he might try to move before Friday. Do something that disrupts the hearing before it can happen. That's what I'm worried about. She looked at him. Where are the remaining documents? The ones we didn't send to Alderman? Still in your box. I need to get them to Alderman's clerk today, she said. All of them before tonight. If Vale is watching my... Then we move carefully. She was already thinking. I'll take them, not you. You stay visible, go to the general store, talk to people, let yourself be seen being calm. If Vale's men are watching, they watch you. I take the box to the hotel this afternoon. Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't say it, she said. We are not doing that again. His jaw tightened, then released. Take the Ridge Road, he said, not the main street. Obviously, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Even now, even in the middle of this, it moved. She took the Ridge Road. She carried the wooden box in a market basket covered with a cloth, beneath 2 jars of preserves she had pulled from the shelf specifically to look ordinary. She walked into town the way she always walked into town, steadily, without hurry, in her good brown boots. Nobody stopped her. At the hotel, she asked for the judge's clerk by name Thomas Hale, as Everett had told her. The young man who came downstairs looked at her, looked at the basket, looked back at her. Mrs. Bellamy, he said. Yes, I have documents for the judge's review. Materials related to the Callahan matter and the broader inquiry. He lowered his voice. Are you being watched? Possibly, she said, equally quietly. I'd recommend moving quickly. He took the basket. He looked at the preserves. You can keep those, she said. The box underneath is what matters. He almost smiled. The judge will see you, he said, if you're willing. He asked specifically if the woman who organized the witness testimony came in, to bring her directly. Clara blinked. He knows about the Rourkes and the Ashworths? He knows someone coordinated 2 witness families in under 48 hours, Hale said. He wanted to meet whoever did that. She was taken upstairs. Judge Alderman was a man in his 60s, compact and precise, with the look of someone who had spent decades reading people across courtroom tables and had arrived at a very efficient system for doing it. He stood when she came in. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "Sit down, please." She sat. He sat. He looked at her for a moment. "Tell me what you know," he said, "about Harrison Vale's operation." "Not what's in the documents. What you observed," she told him. She told him about the conversation at the general store, about Ruth Sperry at her gate, about the 2 men on horseback on the dark road, about the redrawn survey line May Rourke had described, about Declan Crisp and the way a fixer built a story out of real fragments. Alderman listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You understand what Friday will look like," he said. "Callahan will be formally accused. Marsh and Crisp will give their statements. Bradley will preside. And then I will intervene as the regional circuit judge with jurisdictional authority over the underlying land fraud inquiry, at which point this stops being a local hearing and becomes a federal matter. And Vale's accusations against Everett become subordinate to the federal inquiry, which will include reviewing every documentation we've received, including testimony from the Rourkes and the Ashworths." He paused. "In short, if the documents are what your Mr. Callahan says they are, Vale is not just losing a local argument. He's losing everything. He's not my Mr. Callahan," Clara said automatically. Alderman looked at her with the faint, measured amusement of a man who had heard many people say many things and had learned to distinguish between what they said and what they meant. "Of course," he said. "Is there anything else I should know before tomorrow morning?" She thought. "Crisp is good," she said. "He doesn't lie. He reframes. He'll find something true about Everett and put it in a light that makes it look like something it isn't. Whatever he says, look for the gap between what he claims he saw and what he claims it means." Alderman nodded slowly. "That is an extremely useful observation," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Bellamy." She stood. "One more thing," he said. "What you've done in the last 48 hours, organizing witnesses, preserving documents, communicating under observation, without being detected, that is not ordinary." "I'm a woman who lives alone on a farm," she said. "I've been solving problems without help for a long time. This is just a larger problem." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." She walked home quickly. She was 3 blocks from the hotel when the hand came down on her arm. Not violent, not rough, just firm, the kind of grip that says stop without needing to say it out loud. She stopped. She turned. Harrison Vale was standing beside her on the empty afternoon street, without his usual men, without his usual practiced pleasantness. He looked like a man who had done the arithmetic and arrived at a number he didn't like. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "I wonder if you'd give me a moment." She looked at his hand on her arm. He released it. "What do you want, Mr. Vale?" she said. "I want to understand what you think you're doing," he said. "And I'd like you to understand what it will cost you." "I've been visiting the judge's office," she said pleasantly. "I believe citizens are entitled to do that, Alderman." He said the name flatly. "You went to Alderman." She said nothing. "Mrs. Bellamy." He leaned in slightly, and something had dropped from his voice, the pleasantness, the management. What was underneath it was not rage, exactly, but it was cold and it was very certain of itself. "You are a widow with a small farm and no particular standing in this community. You have no money, no family here, no protection beyond the goodwill of people who barely notice you on an ordinary day. Do you understand what I can take from you?" Clara looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at every person in her life who had tried to reduce her to her circumstances, steadily, completely, without flinching. "Yes," she said, "I understand what you think you can take from me." She paused. "But I think you've made a mistake that men like you make very consistently, Mr. Vale. And what's that?" "You looked at me and you saw what I don't have," she said. "You didn't look long enough to see what I do." She walked away from him. She did not hurry. She heard him stand there for a moment, just stand there without moving, which was the sound of a man encountering something he hadn't accounted for in his calculations. Then she heard his boots on the street, moving in the other direction. She turned the corner. She breathed. That night Everett came to her porch. He didn't knock. He sat on the top step the way people sometimes do when they're not sure if they're visiting or just nearby, and she found him there when she went to bring in the last of the firewood. She set the wood down. She sat beside him on the step. It was cold. The sky was clear and enormous, the way Montana skies got in November when there was no cloud cover to soften the distance. They sat for a while without talking. "May Rourke called you about the judge," Everett said. "She did. You didn't tell me. You would have tried to go instead of me." "Yes," he said. He didn't deny it, and it needed to be me, she said. Alderman needed to know who had organized the witnesses. He needed to see that there was someone here who wasn't you who believed in what we were doing. Someone without a stake in your acquittal specifically. "You have a stake, not the kind that looks like one," she said. "I'm a neighbor, a woman who brought a pie." He turned his head and looked at her profile. "Clara," he said. She kept looking at the sky. "I know what tomorrow is," he said. "And I know that whatever happens, he stopped. "Started again. I've been alone for a long time, longer than the years I've been moving. I was alone before I started moving. I was alone in rooms full of people, which is the worst kind." He paused. "And then there were the letters, and I wasn't alone anymore. Even when I didn't know your face, I wasn't alone anymore." She was quiet. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like," he said. "I don't know if Alderman rules the way we need him to, or if Vale has something we haven't found yet, or if Crisp finds the right angle to make the room doubt everything. I don't know, but I know that whatever happens in that room, it's not the thing I'm most afraid of losing." She turned her head. She looked at him. His face was exactly what it always was, weathered, careful, honest. But the distance was gone, the managed quality that he wore the way other men wore hats to keep the sun off. "It was gone, Everett," she said quietly. "I know it's not the time," he said. "I know there's tomorrow, and I know you haven't. You said you needed time, and I'm not asking you to." "Stop talking," she said. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know who you are," she said. "I've known who you are since the first letter. The face is just the face. The rest of you I've known for 2 years." She held his gaze. "I'm not afraid of tomorrow. I know what we built today. I know those documents are in Alderman's hands, and the Rourkes and the Ashworths will walk into that room in the morning, and the truth will be there, present and provable, in a way Vale cannot reframe. And if something goes wrong, then something goes wrong and we deal with it," she said. "But I have spent enough of my life preparing for disaster that I've forgotten to stand in the middle of a good thing and let it be good." She paused. "This is a good thing." He looked at her. Something in him went completely still, not the careful, managed stillness she'd learned to read as caution, but a different kind. The stillness of something that has finally, after a long time, arrived. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They sat on the porch steps until the cold became undeniable, which took longer than either of them had expected. When Clara went inside, she stopped at the door. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow you're going to need to walk into that room and let other people carry it for once in your life." "That's not easy for me," he said. "I know," she said. "Do it anyway." She went inside. The fire was low. She built it back up and sat with her hands close to it and thought about tomorrow, and felt, underneath the worry and the planning and the careful management of everything she could control, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt ready, not fearless. She was not a foolish woman. But ready in the way that only comes when you've done everything you can do and you know it. And what's left is just the morning. The morning would come, and Clara Bellamy would walk into it in her good brown boots, with her head up and her hands steady, the way she had walked into every hard thing since she was old enough to understand that nobody was coming to carry her. Except that this time, for the first time, she would not be walking alone. Friday arrived the way Clara had known it would. Without ceremony, without warning, just a gray November morning that looked exactly like any other morning, except that everything in it weighed more than usual. She was up before 4. She did not pretend to sleep past it. She made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and went through it all one more time, not because she'd missed anything, but because going through it again was the only thing that stood between her and the particular fear that arrived in the small hours before important mornings. The fear that said, "You've forgotten something. You've missed something." It won't be enough, she breathed. She had not forgotten anything. The documents were in Alderman's hands. The Rourkes and the Ashworths had agreed to be in that room. Cole Garrett had done his job. Everett would walk in and tell the truth. And Clara Bellamy would walk in beside him and let the truth be what it was. She drank her coffee, put on her good brown boots, and walked out into the dark. The Willow Creek Church held maybe 80 people when it was full for Sunday service. By the time Clara arrived at 8:30, it was already crowded in a way that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the particular hunger small towns had for events that promised consequence. She moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, steadily, without performing, reading the temperature as she went. What she read was this: most of the room was uncertain. They had heard enough about Everett to be curious, enough about Vale to be cautious, and enough about Friday morning to want to see what happened before they decided what to believe. That was enough. Uncertain rooms could move. She found the Rourkes near the left side, May, with her oilcloth-wrapped survey documents held against her side, like something she would not be dropping. Donald stood with his arms crossed, jaw set, the posture of a man who had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. Clara caught May's eye. May gave her one sharp nod. The Ashworths were 3 rows back. Jacob Ashworth looked like a man walking into a fire he'd agreed to walk into and was not going to back down from, which was exactly the kind of courage that mattered. His wife Susan sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level. Clara took her own seat. She looked toward the front of the room. Sheriff Bradley stood near the small raised platform, shuffling papers with the expression of a man who had realized this morning was larger than he'd prepared for, and was managing his face about it. Eli Marsh was seated to the right, neatly dressed, rehearsed. Declan Crisp sat beside him, and even from across the room Crisp had the quality of a man who was comfortable in public spaces and knew how to use that comfort. Harrison Vale was in the front row. He was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the door, looking for Alderman. Clara watched him put together the calculation, the judge in town, the hearing this morning. The documents he didn't know the full extent of, and she watched his expression do something brief and difficult before he put it away and replaced it with his usual still surface. He was afraid. He was hiding it well, but she knew what it looked like. The door at the back of the room opened, and Everett came in. He was clean-shaved. His shirt was pressed. He held his hat with both hands, and he walked to the front of the room, without looking left or right. The walk of a man who had decided something in the night and was finished deciding. He sat down. He did not look at Clara. She understood that he needed to walk in on his own terms, look like a man who was standing for himself. She did not take it personally. She looked at the back of his shoulders and thought, "I know you. I have known you for 2 years. You are not alone in this room." Bradley called the room to order. The morning began. Eli Marsh gave his statement first. He was polished. Clara would give him that. He spoke about the supply depot outside Laramie with the careful confidence of a man who had rehearsed it enough times that it no longer felt like performance. He named dates. He named witnesses. He described what he said he'd seen with the practiced specificity of someone who knew that specific details made people believe you even when the details were constructed. Bradley listened. The room listened. Everett sat quietly. Clara watched the room and watched Everett and watched Bradley's face, which was doing the thing faces do when a man is hearing something that fits neatly into a story he's already half prepared to believe. Then Bradley asked if anyone wished to respond to Marsh's statement before the next speaker. Everett stood. "I was not in Laramie in the autumn of 1884, he said. His voice was clear and unhurried. "I was in Cheyenne working a cattle contract for the Henderson operation." I have written records of that work, and so does Robert Henderson, who is still operating in Wyoming and whose correspondence I provided to this office 3 days ago." Bradley blinked. He shuffled his papers. Clara watched him find the document, read it, and recalibrate. "The Henderson contract," Everett said. "Signed, dated, with delivery logs for every week of that autumn." Marsh for the first time shifted in his seat. It was small, barely visible. Clara saw it, so did Donald Rourke, because Donald leaned very slightly toward his wife, and May did not move, but her grip on the oilcloth tightened. Declan Crisp did not shift. He watched Everett with the attentiveness of a man recalculating, which was different from reacting. Crisp never reacted. He adjusted. That was what made him dangerous. He was adjusting right now. Crisp stood when Bradley called him. He was measured, warm, and almost entirely non-specific in the way that only people who've done this many times can be. He talked about Everett's history of moving true. He talked about the pattern of a man who appeared in places with vulnerable properties and found ways to make himself useful, true technically, in the way that breathing is technically related to speaking. He talked about the widow in Colorado, about the weeks on her property, about the exchange of labor for meals, and he let the silence after each statement do the work of implying things he hadn't said. The room was very quiet. Clara felt the temperature drop. Crisp was good. She had known he was good, and she felt it now, felt the way he was turning real things into a shape that looked like something else, and felt the room accepting that shape because it was easier to accept than the alternative. She gripped her hands together in her lap. Then Bradley said, "Does anyone wish to speak on Mr. Callahan's behalf?" Clara stood up. The room turned. She felt it turn, all those faces, the weight of the room's attention, the particular quality of a crowd that has just noticed the unexpected. She was aware of what they saw: a large woman in a brown dress and good boots, standing in the middle of the room without being called on, without being invited, without waiting for permission. "My name is Clara Bellamy," she said. Her voice was clear and steady, and reached the back of the room without effort. "I am Everett Callahan's neighbor, and I have something this room needs to hear." Bradley said, "Mrs. Bellamy, this is an official proceeding." "I understand that," she said, "and I'm asking for 2 minutes. What I have to say is directly relevant to the statements just made." Bradley looked at her, looked at the room. The room was watching him. He nodded. She reached into her bag. She pulled out 3 letters, not the business documents. Those were with Alderman. These were 3 of Declan Crisp's reframed truths, and beside each one, the actual record of what had happened. "Mr. Crisp mentioned the widow in Colorado," she said. "Her name is Martha Dunbar. She lives in Pueblo. 3 weeks ago I wrote to her." She paused. She wrote back. Her letter arrived yesterday. The room went absolutely still. Clara held up the letter. "Mrs. Dunbar states that Everett Callahan repaired her south fence and cleared a collapsed outbuilding after her husband died, that he refused payment, that he left after 3 weeks without incident, and that the only reason any money changed hands was that she insisted on paying him $1 for his boots, which wore through while he was working." She set the letter on Bradley's table. She also states that she would be happy to appear before any court that required her, but that she considers it an embarrassment to her community, that a man who helped her without being asked is being described as someone who took advantage of her. Crisp had not moved, but Vale had. Vale had shifted barely, almost invisibly, and in that shift Clara saw everything she needed to see. He had not known about Martha Dunbar's letter. He had not calculated for it. Because he had looked at Clara Bellamy and seen a woman with no connections, no resources, no ability to reach across state lines in 48 hours, and he had been wrong. He had been so completely, specifically wrong about her. "Furthermore," Clara said, and her voice was still steady, still clear, "I want to address the suggestion that Everett Callahan has a pattern of targeting vulnerable women. I am one of the women Mr. Crisp is implying he targeted." She looked at the room directly. "Mr. Callahan repaired my fence. He helped my wagon out of a mud hole. He carried supplies when my back was giving me trouble. Not one of those things was uninvited. Not one of them came with conditions." She paused. "I am not a woman who was taken advantage of. I am a woman who was treated with respect. And I would ask this room to consider the difference between those two things before deciding what kind of man Everett Callahan is. The room was silent. Then May Rourke stood up. "I'd like to speak," May said. Bradley, who was by now operating entirely outside the proceeding he had planned, nodded. May spoke for 4 minutes. She was precise, factual, and devastating. She described the survey line. She described the documents. She described watching 40 acres of her father's land get quietly reassigned on a county map without her family's knowledge or consent. She set the oilcloth-wrapped survey records on Bradley's table beside Martha Dunbar's letter. Jacob Ashworth stood next. He was less polished than May. His hands weren't steady, and his voice had a roughness to it that wasn't performance. He talked about the pressure his family had been under for 2 years, the offers that weren't quite offers, the implications that weren't quite threats. The way a man with enough money and enough patience could make your life smaller and smaller without ever doing anything that looked, from outside, like what it actually was. He was more powerful than May for exactly that reason. Crisp still had not moved. Vale was looking at the floor. And then the back door of the church opened. Judge Alderman walked in. The room felt him before it saw him. There was a quality to a federal judge entering a room that was different from other entrances, something in the way the air changed, the way people straightened without deciding to, the way even the people who didn't know exactly who he was sensed that something authoritative had arrived. Alderman walked to the front without hurrying. He looked at Bradley. Bradley stood up immediately. "Your Honor," Bradley said. "Sit down, Sheriff," Alderman said pleasantly. "I'm not here to disrupt your proceeding. I'm here because it intersects with a federal matter that I've been investigating for the past 4 months, and I believe this room deserves to understand how those two things connect." He looked at Vale. Vale looked back at him. The two men held each other's gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Clara watched Harrison Vale understand that Alderman already had everything, not just the documents from Everett, but 4 months of independent inquiry, corroborating records from 3 counties and 2 local families who had just stood up in a church and said what they'd seen. The math was finished. Vale knew it. Crisp stood up. "Your Honor," Crisp said smoothly, "I wonder if I might." "Sit down, Mr. Crisp," Alderman said. He hadn't looked at Crisp. He was still looking at Vale. "I know who you are. I know who engaged you. I know why you're here, and I want you to be very careful about what you say next, because this is now a federal proceeding, and everything said in this room is on record." Crisp sat down. It was the fastest Clara had ever seen that man move. Alderman turned to the room. "I'm going to explain what's happening," he said, "because this community deserves to understand what has been done inside it, and by whom. And then we're going to talk about what happens next." He spoke for 12 minutes. Clara did not take her eyes off the room as he spoke, watched the faces, watched the shifting, watched the moment when people who had come in uncertain began to arrive at something else. Not fury exactly, not yet, something quieter, the particular feeling of having been deceived inside a place you trusted, which was its own specific wound. Alderman laid it out clearly, the survey manipulation across 3 properties, the correspondence between Vale and his brother, the documentation of pressure applied to 2 families. Eli Marsh's false statement, which Alderman addressed directly and without softening a sworn statement known to be false, is perjury, and it will be treated as such. Marsh had gone the color of old paper. Alderman turned to Everett. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I want to say something in this room, in front of these people, because I believe it matters where and how it's said." He paused. "The documentation you preserved over 7 years, at personal risk, with no guarantee it would ever be useful, that documentation is the foundation of this inquiry. Without it, the testimony of the Rourke and Ashworth families, however credible, would have been harder to act on. You carried that for a long time. That was not a small thing." Everett was very still. "You also failed to act at a critical moment 7 years ago," Alderman said without softening it. "That is also true, and I won't pretend otherwise. Both things are true. This proceeding won't erase either of them. What it will do is ensure that the record is accurate. The room was silent. Everett nodded once. "Yes, sir," he said. "That's all I ever wanted." Bradley formally adjourned the local hearing and yielded jurisdiction to the federal inquiry before noon. Vale did not speak during any of it. He sat in the front row with his hands on his knees and his face very still and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. Crisp was gone before the room fully cleared there one moment, then simply absent, because men like Crisp understood when the contract had expired and moved accordingly. Eli Marsh did not leave quickly. He sat for a while after most of the room had emptied, looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man recounting the steps that had brought him here, and finding several he wished he could take back. Clara did not feel sorry for him. She might have once. But she had watched May Rourke's hands shake when she stood up, and Jacob Ashworth's voice break twice, and she had no sympathy left over for men who had been paid to break good people. Donald Rourke found her near the door. He shook her hand firm, brief, the handshake of a man who didn't do things halfway. "Whatever you need," he said. "You or Callahan. Whatever you need." May hugged her, which Clara had not expected, and which she returned without hesitation. The Ashworths left quietly, but Jacob stopped at the door and turned back, and looked at her for a moment, and nodded, and she nodded back, and that was everything that needed to be said between them. She stood near the door for a while after, letting the room empty, watching it return to just being a church. Then Everett was beside her. She heard him before she felt him, not his footsteps exactly, but the particular quality of his presence that she had learned over the past weeks, the way the air felt slightly different when he was close. He stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Alderman wants to meet with me Monday morning," he said. "Full testimony. Everything I know. Will you be ready?" "Yes," she nodded. "Vale," she said. "Alderman's men rode to his property an hour ago. He's not going anywhere while the inquiry is open." Silence. "Martha Dunbar," Everett said. "I wrote to her 4 days ago," Clara said. "She's a plain-spoken woman." Her letter was very direct. He was quiet for a moment. "You wrote to a stranger in Colorado to find proof I was telling the truth," he said. "I wrote to a woman who I thought deserved to be asked about her own experience," Clara said. "Whether or not it helped you was secondary." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Clara," he said. She turned. His face was the open face, the one she'd seen the night he told her who he was, the one without the mannerisms, the one that was just him. He was looking at her the way she had spent 2 years imagining being looked at, and now that she was standing inside it she felt, absurdly, like she wanted to take a step back, just to make sure it was real. "I know you said you needed time," he said. "I did say that. Have you had enough?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 47 letters in a wooden box. She thought about the pie she'd wrapped in flour-dusted cloth and carried 1.5 miles, because she'd told herself it didn't mean anything. She thought about a man sitting on her porch steps in the cold, because he wasn't ready to leave and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She thought about all the years she'd spent telling herself that she was the kind of woman who didn't get chosen, who didn't get seen, who should be practical about what was available to her in a world that had already decided what she was worth. She thought about being wrong. "Yes," she said, "I've had enough time." Something moved through his expression, not surprise, because she thought he'd learned to read her too well for surprise. Just relief, deep and quiet, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a long time. He reached out. He took her hand, not dramatic, not performed. Just his hand around hers in a room that was almost empty on a Friday morning in November. She let him. The weeks that followed were not perfect. Alderman's inquiry took 3 months and involved testimony from 8 families across 3 counties, and there were difficult days in the middle of it when the outcome felt less certain than it had on that Friday morning. Vale had lawyers. Vale had money. Vale had the particular endurance of a man who had spent decades making problems go away and believed his own ability to do it. But he did not have the letters, and he did not have Everett Callahan, who sat across from federal officials on a Monday morning and told the truth about everything, including the things that reflected badly on him. including the moment 7 years ago when a woman named Margaret Freed had come to a gate with her children, and he had failed her. He told it plainly, without excusing it, and then he told everything else he knew. Alderman's final ruling came down in February. Vale's operation was dissolved. 3 land transfers were reversed. Survey records were corrected across 2 counties. Eli Marsh was charged with perjury, and the families whose land had been quietly moved under them got back what was theirs. Margaret Freed, whom Alderman's office had located in Nebraska, received a formal acknowledgement and a settlement from the inquiry fund. Everett paid the 11 cents it cost to send her a personal letter. Clara didn't ask what the letter said. She thought she knew. Spring came to Willow Creek the way spring always came to Montana, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold mornings that gave way to afternoons that were finally, unmistakably warm. Clara's garden came back. Her chickens, who had been indignant about the winter, resumed their opinions about everything. The Rourkes had her to dinner 3 times before April. Mrs. Hatch, to her credit and Clara's genuine surprise, came by one morning in March with a jar of plum preserves and said simply, "I was wrong about him. I wanted you to know I know that." Clara thanked her, offered coffee, and meant it. The town didn't make a ceremony of changing its mind about Everett. Small towns rarely did, but the change happened visible in small things. The way a rancher stopped to talk to him on the main street, the way Bradley shook his hand and looked him in the eye. The way the general store started stocking the specific coffee he preferred without being asked. He was becoming part of the place. He was staying. On a morning in April, Clara opened her door and found an envelope wedged between the frame and the wood. No stamp, no postmark. Just her name on the front in the large and slightly uneven handwriting she had known for 2 years before she knew the face behind it. She sat at her kitchen table and opened it. It was not a long letter. W had always been capable of long letters, but his best ones, the ones she'd kept the longest, the ones worn soft along the folds, were the short ones. The ones where he'd said exactly what he meant and stopped. "Clara, I have spent 2 years writing to you from the wrong side of every distance. I don't know how to write a letter to someone who is a mile away, and also the only person I want to write to. So I'm just going to say it directly, which you've always told me is the best way to say anything. I would like to court you properly, if you're willing. Dinners at Mercer's and walks on the Ridge Road and whatever else constitutes proper in a frontier town in 1887. Not because I need to convince you of anything I think we're past convincing. But because I want to do this right, I want to choose you out loud in front of whatever people happen to be watching. You have been chosen. You have been chosen since long before either of us understood what we were doing. I just want you to be sure you know it, WPS. I have the coffee on if you'd like some." Clara read the letter once. She stood up. She put on her good brown boots. She walked north. He was on the porch when she came through his gate, which meant he'd heard her wagon, except she hadn't taken the wagon. She'd walked, so he'd been watching for her. She considered what to do with that information and decided to simply let it be true. He came down the porch steps. He stopped in front of her. "I got your letter," she said. "I know. Dinner at Mercer's is fine," she said. "But I want you to know I've been properly courted before, and it's not as impressive as people make it sound." "I know," he said. "I was thinking less about impressive and more about honest." She looked at him. He looked back. And she thought about everything that had traveled between them: 11 cents in postage and 47 letters, and a pie in a flour-dusted cloth, and a barn in the first snow of winter, and a church on a Friday morning, and a woman standing up in a room full of people, and a man who told the truth about everything, even the parts that cost him, and she thought that the word honest was the most accurate word anyone had ever used for what they were to each other. "Honest is good," she said. He held out his hand. She took it. They went inside for coffee, and the door closed behind them, and the morning went on around the cabin the way Montana mornings did, big and unhurried, and entirely unconcerned with the smallness of human fear. Because the fear was finished. What was left was simply this: 2 people who had found each other through the most ordinary miracle in the world, the act of telling the truth to someone who was listening and had chosen, with full knowledge of each other's history and weight and complexity, to stay. Clara Bellamy had spent years believing she was the kind of woman nobody chose. She had been wrong, and the man who had proven her wrong had done it not with grand gestures or borrowed words, but with 47 letters written in the dark, carried across impossible distances, preserved against every reason to let them go, because somewhere in him, even before he knew her face, he had already understood that she was worth keeping. Some love stories begin with a look across a crowded room. This one began with 11 cents in postage and a dead woman's letter, and two people who had nothing in common except the willingness to be honest about being alone. And that was more than enough. That had always been more than enough.